Japanese men are refusing to speak to women. The most shocking truth emerging from Japan's current reality is this. In recent years, the country has recorded birth numbers plummeting to around 686,000 in 2024, with projections for 2025 dipping even lower towards 667,000 or below, marking historic lows since records began in 1899 and signaling a fertility rate sinking to 1.15 children per woman, far below the replacement level needed for any society to sustain itself long term. This is not some distant future warning. It is happening right now, and the core reason traces back to a growing number of Japanese men who have simply stopped pursuing romantic relationships, stopped seeking marriage, and stopped engaging in the traditional roles that once drove family formation and national continuity. What you are about to hear is the full story of how a nation once celebrated for its discipline, innovation, and social harmony has reached a point where entire regions face disappearance from the map. Economies strain under the weight of an aging population, and women increasingly find themselves in a landscape where the men they once dismissed or held to impossible standards have chosen solitude over participation, leaving society to confront the consequences of decades of shifting dynamics. Japan stands today as a vivid example of what occurs when large segments of men withdraw from the pursuit of relationships and family life, a phenomenon that has roots stretching back decades, but has accelerated in ways that demand serious examination. The term herbivore men, or Soshoku danshi in Japanese, first appeared around 2006, describing young men who display little aggressive interest in romance, sex, or marriage, preferring instead to focus on personal hobbies, self improvement, friendships, and a balanced existence free from the pressures of traditional courtship. These men do not chase women with the intensity once common. They avoid the risks, costs, and emotional labor associated with dating in a modern context where expectations have shifted dramatically. Surveys over the years have shown significant portions of young Japanese men identifying with this mindset, with some estimates suggesting over 60% of certain age groups aligning with herbivore traits, prioritizing individual fulfillment over relational commitment. This detachment has contributed directly to declining marriage rates, fewer intimate partnerships, and ultimately the record low birth figures that now alarm policymakers and demographers alike. Consider the broader demographic picture unfolding in Japan right now. The population peaked around 2008 at approximately 128 million and has since declined steadily, dropping below 124 million in recent counts, with annual natural decreases reaching nearly 900,000 people, as deaths far outpace births. Projections indicate that by the end of the century, the population could fall below 80 million, potentially halving from its peak, creating an inverted population pyramid where the elderly vastly outnumber the young. Rural areas suffer first and most visibly, with villages emptying out as older residents pass away without replacements, houses standing abandoned, schools closing for lack of children, and local economies collapsing under the absence of workers and consumers. Cities like Tokyo experience slower but still noticeable effects, with workforce shortages straining industries, pension systems buckling under the load of supporting a growing proportion of retirees nearing 30% of the population over 65, and innovation facing risks from a shrinking pool of young talent. This is not mere statistics. It represents the unraveling of a society's foundational structure where each generation becomes smaller than the last, unable to support the infrastructure, healthcare, and economic vitality built by previous ones. At the heart of this crisis lies a profound shift in gender dynamics and expectations that has unfolded over generations. Following the economic boom of the 1980s and early 90s, Japan saw rapid advancements in women's education, workforce participation, and social status influenced by global ideas of equality and independence. Women gained greater financial autonomy, entered professions in larger numbers, and began questioning traditional roles that once centered on marriage and homemaking. This progress brought undeniable benefits, expanding opportunities and challenging outdated norms. However, as economic conditions changed after the asset bubble burst in the early 90s, leading to decades of stagnation known as the lost decades, the landscape for relationships altered in complex ways. Men faced intense competition for stable employment, long working hours that left little energy for personal life, and rising costs that made providing for a family feel increasingly unattainable for many. Meanwhile, dating and marriage began to carry higher material and emotional expectations, with pressures for gifts, outings, and financial demonstrations that eliminated men without substantial resources from the equation, creating what some describe as a form of dating capitalism where only the economically secure could participate effectively. Men responded to these pressures not with confrontation, but with withdrawal, a quiet opting out that has proven far more impactful than any overt resistance. Many young men, observing the risks of rejection, potential misunderstandings in social interactions, or the high costs with uncertain returns, simply chose not to engage. They turned inward, investing time in hobbies such as gaming, anime, reading, or personal projects that offered satisfaction without the vulnerabilities of romance. This choice reflects a rational adaptation to a system where the incentives for pursuing relationships diminished while the downsides remained high. Virginity rates among men in their 30s have risen noticeably compared to earlier generations, with figures in recent surveys showing percentages in the double digits for certain age groups, contrasting sharply with much lower rates in other developed nations. These men often report contentment in their solitude, finding peace in routines that avoid drama, financial strain, and emotional uncertainty. They have not abandoned society entirely, but have redefined their place within it, focusing on self reliance and low stress living rather than traditional markers of success like marriage and children. This withdrawal has cascading effects that touch every aspect of Japanese life. With fewer marriages occurring later in life, or not at all, the number of births continues its steep descent, as cultural norms still tie childbearing closely to wedlock. Government efforts to reverse the trend, including subsidies for childcare, expanded parental leave, tax incentives, and even promotional campaigns featuring popular media to encourage family formation, have so far failed to halt the decline. The fertility rate hovers well below replacement level, and each year brings fresh records of fewer newborns. Entire regions face literal disappearance from maps as populations dwindle to unsustainable levels, with local governments merging towns or abandoning services once taken for granted. The economy feels the strain through reduced consumer demand, labor shortages in key sectors, and mounting pressure on social security systems designed for a different demographic reality. Innovation, long a strength of Japan, risks slowing as fewer young minds enter fields requiring sustained energy and creativity. The society that once prided itself on harmony and collective progress now grapples with isolation, loneliness epidemics, and phenomena like kadokushi, where people pass away unnoticed in their homes for extended periods. Women, too, navigate a transformed reality in this environment. Many express frustration at the lack of proactive interest from men, with some turning to dating apps or social events only to encounter similar detachment or mismatched expectations. The traditional dynamic where men initiated and pursued has shifted, leaving women in a position where they sometimes must take the lead. Yet cultural norms still make this feel unnatural or unwelcome for many. Economic independence offers freedom, but also isolation when partnerships prove elusive, and the societal emphasis on perfection and conformity adds layers of pressure to find ideal matches rather than settle.
The system is collapsing. Cash will be worthless soon. Crypto is your only escape. Angry's Crypto Academy is linked in the description. Go check it out now.
As birth rates fall, women face a future where supporting an aging population falls heavier on smaller generations, potentially limiting their own choices further. The overall picture reveals a mutual loss where both men and women suffer from the breakdown in connection, yet the withdrawal of men as the traditional initiators has accelerated the visible consequences. The story extends beyond individual choices to broader forces that shaped this outcome. Economic stagnation following the bubble era created a low wage environment for many, where secure lifetime employment became rarer and competition fiercer. Work culture demanding exhaustive hours left little room for personal relationships, fostering exhaustion and apathy toward additional commitments. Social media and global influences amplified standards of attractiveness and success, making average individuals feel inadequate in comparison and further discouraging pursuit. Legal and social protections against harassment, while necessary and important for safety, have in some cases heightened men's caution around interactions, fearing misinterpretation or severe repercussions from even innocent approaches. These elements combined to make the pursuit of romance feel like a high risk endeavor with diminishing rewards, prompting more men to opt for the certainty of solitude. Japan serves as a mirror for other nations observing similar patterns emerge where economic pressures, shifting gender roles, and cultural changes intersect to reduce family formation. The nation's experience demonstrates that when men, as historical gatekeepers of relational initiative and reproduction, step back en masse, the repercussions unfold rapidly across decades, affecting prosperity, social cohesion, and even national identity. Societies thrive when men and women collaborate in building families and communities, but when that collaboration fractures, the foundation weakens. In Japan, the fracture has deepened, and the task of repair grows more urgent with each passing year of decline. The relentless downward spiral in Japan's birth numbers continues unabated into the current decade, with preliminary figures indicating that births in 2025 likely hovered around 667,542 or slightly below, representing yet another historic low and marking the 10th consecutive year of record declines since reliable tracking began in 1899. This number falls well short of earlier official projections that anticipated closer to 749,000, underscoring how even the most conservative demographic forecasts have repeatedly underestimated the speed and depth of the collapse. The fertility rate, already scraping bottom at around 1.2 children per woman in recent years, shows no meaningful rebound despite massive governmental interventions, and the natural population decrease accelerates as deaths from an aging cohort outstrip these dwindling births by hundreds of thousands annually. What emerges from this data is a clear pattern. The withdrawal of men from active pursuit of relationships and family building has locked in a trajectory that no subsidy, no policy tweak, and no public campaign has yet managed to reverse. Delving deeper into the mechanics of this withdrawal reveals layers of economic and cultural pressures that have compounded over time to make traditional male roles in courtship feel increasingly burdensome and unrewarding. The post bubble economy of the 1990s ushered in an era of wage stagnation, precarious employment, and the erosion of lifetime job security that once defined Japanese masculinity and provision. Young men entering the workforce today often face irregular contracts, part time positions, or long hours in low pay sectors that leave little disposable income or energy for dating expenses like elaborate dates, gifts, or the financial demonstrations expected in modern courtship rituals. Surveys consistently highlight how these financial realities deter engagement, with many men concluding that the costs of pursuing a partner outweigh the perceived benefits when personal stability already feels fragile. This economic squeeze dovetails with cultural shifts where expectations for partners have risen on both sides. Yet the traditional expectation remains that men shoulder the primary burden of initiation, planning, and provision, creating a mismatch that discourages participation. Beyond finances, the social environment has evolved in ways that heighten perceived risks for men who attempt to approach women. Heightened awareness of harassment issues, combined with strict workplace and public conduct norms, has led many men to err on the side of caution, avoiding any interaction that could be misinterpreted or lead to professional or social consequences. What might have once been seen as normal flirtation or casual conversation now carries potential for serious fallout, prompting a defensive posture where inaction feels safer than action. This caution extends to digital spaces as well, where dating apps, while abundant, often amplify superficial judgments based on photos, profiles, and to instant metrics that favor a narrow band of high status individuals, leaving average men feeling invisible or rejected before conversations even begin. The result is a self reinforcing cycle. Fewer approaches lead to fewer successful connections, which in turn normalizes disengagement as the default mode for growing numbers of men. These individual choices aggregate into systemic effects that reshape entire communities and industries. In rural prefectures, the absence of young families has already triggered school consolidations, hospital closures, and the shuttering of small businesses reliant on local demand, creating ghost towns where infrastructure decays without maintenance or replacement workers. Urban centers, while more resilient, experience subtle but accumulating strains. Public transportation routes cut back due to lower ridership. Elder care facilities overwhelmed as the ratio of working age supporters to retirees worsens, and innovation ecosystems challenged by a shrinking pipeline of fresh graduates entering research and development fields. The pension and healthcare systems, designed during a period of population growth, now face actuarial nightmares as contributions from a shrinking workforce must cover exploding costs for an expanding elderly population that could approach 40% by mid century under current trends. Government responses have grown increasingly ambitious, yet their limited success highlights the depth of the underlying dynamics. Recent initiatives include expanded child allowances extended through high school age without income caps, full coverage for natural childbirth expenses, tuition support for higher education in multi child households, and enhanced parental leave benefits aiming for 100% wage replacement when both parents take time off shortly after birth. Additional measures promote paternity leave on uptake, targeting 50% of new fathers by 2025 and 85% by 2030, alongside subsidies for childcare and efforts to normalize flexible work arrangements like 4-day weeks in some public sectors. A dedicated population strategy headquarters coordinates these efforts, backed by trillions of yen in annual funding. Yet births continue their descent, suggesting that financial incentives alone fail to address the core relational disengagement driving the decline. This failure points to a fundamental asymmetry in how men and women experience modern dating and family pressures. While women have gained substantial independence through education and career opportunities, allowing many to thrive without relying on marriage for economic security, men have not seen equivalent shifts in expectations around initiation and provision. The result is a landscape where women can afford to be selective, often holding out for partners who meet elevated standards in income, stability, appearance, and emotional compatibility, while men facing rejection or high barriers increasingly opt out rather than compete in what feels like a rigged game. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. This selectivity, amplified by social media portrayals of idealized lifestyles and partners, contributes to a perception gap where average individuals on both sides feel mismatched, further entrenching singlehood. Historical parallels offer context for understanding the scale of this shift. Japan has experienced demographic challenges before, such as post war baby booms followed by rapid fertility drops, but the current phase stands apart in its persistence and the role of voluntary male withdrawal. Unlike earlier periods where economic hardship or war disrupted family formation temporarily, today's pattern reflects deliberate choices towards solitude, enabled by a society that provides basic security without requiring relational participation for survival. Hobbies, virtual communities, personal entertainment, and low pressure social networks offer fulfillment that once depended more heavily on family and romantic bonds, allowing men to sustain contentment without the traditional pathways of marriage and children. The psychological dimensions of this withdrawal merit close attention. Many men describe a sense of liberation in stepping away from the performance of courtship, freed from anxiety over rejection, financial demands, or the effort required to maintain relationships amid exhausting work schedules. Contentment in solitude becomes a rational adaptation when alternatives seem fraught with risk and uncertainty. This mindset spreads through peer influence and online discussions, normalizing the choice to prioritize self care, hobbies, and minimalism over family building. For some, it represents a quiet protest against a system that once demanded male sacrifice without commensurate rewards. For others, it simply feels like the path of least resistance in a world where personal peace outweighs societal expectations. Women navigating this reality encounter their own challenges. Many voice genuine difficulty finding partners who show initiative or commitment, with some turning to international dating or resigning to single life, despite desires for family. The cultural ideal of harmonious partnerships persists, yet practical realities make realization elusive, leading to frustration expressed in online forums and media. As the population ages further, women may shoulder disproportionate burdens in caregiving roles, both for elderly relatives and potentially in professional sectors facing shortages, compounding the sense of imbalance. Comparisons with neighboring nations reveal that Japan's experience, while extreme, echoes trends elsewhere in East Asia, where rapid modernization, intense work cultures, and shifting gender norms intersect. South Korea, with even lower fertility rates, shows similar patterns of male disengagement and female selectivity, while China grapples with post one child policy imbalances. These cases suggest that Japan's trajectory may foreshadow broader challenges in advanced economies where economic pressures and cultural evolution disrupt traditional family formation without clear replacements. The long term implications extend to national identity and global standing. A shrinking population risks diminishing Japan's influence in international affairs, reducing its economic weight and challenging cultural continuity as traditions tied to multi generational families fade. Innovation, long fueled by a disciplined and educated workforce, may slow without sufficient young contributors, while defense and infrastructure maintenance strain under demographic weight. These are not abstract concerns, but unfolding realities that demand recognition of how men's collective withdrawal has become a pivotal force in reshaping society. The acceleration of Japan's demographic collapse has entered a phase where even the most dire official projections now appear overly optimistic, as preliminary indications for 2025 point to births falling below 670,000, potentially settling around 667,500 or lower, shattering records that have stood since the late 19th century and confirming a 10th straight year of unprecedented lows. This figure represents a drop of roughly 3% from the already dismal 686,000 recorded in 2024, and it arrives despite sustained efforts to stabilize the trend through unprecedented fiscal commitments. The fertility rate itself lingers near 1.1 to 1.2 children per woman, a level that ensures each generation shrinks dramatically relative to the previous one, locking in decades of contraction that no short term intervention has managed to disrupt. What stands out most starkly is how this outcome stems not from some sudden catastrophe, but from the steady, cumulative effect of men choosing disengagement from the romantic and reproductive spheres, a choice that has proven resilient against both incentives and appeals to national duty. One critical dimension that amplifies this withdrawal involves the transformation of housing and living arrangements in contemporary Japan. Sky high real estate prices in major metropolitan areas, combined with stagnant wages for many young workers, make the prospect of establishing an independent household feel remote for large segments of the male population. The dream of owning a home suitable for raising a family remains tied to secure, high earning employment that fewer men attain in the current economy, leading many to remain in parental homes well into their 30s or 40s, a phenomenon known as parasite singles. This prolonged co residence with parents provides financial breathing room and emotional stability, but simultaneously reduces the urgency to form independent partnerships or pursue marriage, as basic needs are met without the traditional drive to build one's own nest. For men in this situation, the calculus shifts. Why undertake the stress and expense of courtship when personal space, hobbies, and modest comforts are already accessible at low cost? The result is a further delay or outright abandonment of family oriented milestones, contributing directly to the marriage squeeze, where fewer unions form and those that do occur happen later, compressing the window for childbearing. Technological advancements and digital ecosystems have further reinforced this detachment by offering compelling alternatives to real world intimacy. The proliferation of high quality entertainment, from immersive video games and streaming services to virtual reality experiences and anime subcultures, provides outlets for emotional and creative fulfillment that demand far less vulnerability than pursuing human relationships. Many men invest significant time and resources into these domains, building communities around shared interests that deliver companionship without the complications of romance, jealousy, or compromise. Online spaces allow for interaction on one's own terms, free from the fear of rejection or social missteps that accompany in person approaches. This digital refuge has grown so robust that it competes effectively with traditional dating, especially when economic barriers already discourage participation. The outcome is a generation where personal satisfaction derives increasingly from solitary or virtual pursuits, diminishing the perceived necessity of romantic involvement and, by extension, reproduction. Workplace culture remains another entrenched barrier that pushes men toward withdrawal. Despite incremental reforms, many industries still demand grueling hours, mandatory overtime, and loyalty that leaves scant time or mental bandwidth for nurturing relationships. The expectation that men prioritize career advancement to become viable providers clashes with the reality of limited upward mobility in a mature economy, creating burnout and disillusionment. When long commutes and relentless schedules dominate daily life, the energy required to plan dates, maintain emotional connections, or navigate the subtleties of modern courtship simply evaporates. Men who experience this exhaustion often conclude that solitude offers superior quality of life compared to the double burden of demanding work and demanding relationships. This realization spreads organically through conversations among peers, solidifying a cultural norm where opting out gains legitimacy rather than stigma. The interplay between these factors creates a feedback loop that entrenches the trend. As fewer men initiate contact, women face a shrinking pool of proactive partners, which in turn heightens selectivity and raises standards further, discouraging even more men from attempting entry into the dating market. Social events, group gatherings, and traditional matchmaking opportunities diminish in frequency, replaced by individualized leisure that reinforces isolation. Media portrayals of successful relationships often emphasize perfection and material success, setting benchmarks that feel unattainable for ordinary individuals and adding psychological weight to the decision to abstain. Over time, this cycle normalizes singlehood and childlessness as default states rather than deviations, embedding them deeply into societal expectations. Efforts to counteract these dynamics through policy have expanded significantly in scope and ambition, yet their impact remains marginal at best. The latest acceleration plans include universal child allowances extended through adolescence, removal of income thresholds for eligibility, substantial subsidies for fertility treatments, and pushes toward full insurance coverage for childbirth expenses targeted for implementation around 2026. Parental leave enhancements aim for near total wage replacement and higher uptake among fathers, while workplace reforms promote shorter hours and flexible arrangements in select sectors. Billions in annual funding support these measures, with dedicated coordination bodies overseeing rollout. Local experiments in certain municipalities demonstrate modest successes, such as temporary upticks in births following generous local incentives, but national aggregates show no reversal, suggesting that structural and attitudinal barriers outweigh financial relief in influencing core decisions around family formation. International observers frequently draw lessons from Japan's experience, noting parallels in other advanced economies where similar forces operate at varying intensities. Nations with intense academic and professional competition, high living costs, and evolving gender norms witness declining marriage and fertility without the same extreme withdrawal seen in Japan. Yet the direction remains consistent. The Japanese case stands out for the clarity of male disengagement as a dominant factor, offering a cautionary example of how unaddressed incentives can cascade into existential challenges for society. Policymakers elsewhere scrutinize these developments, weighing whether similar patterns could emerge if economic pressures and cultural shifts continue unchecked. The human element in this story deserves recognition beyond statistics. Countless men describe a quiet satisfaction in lives centered on personal growth, friendships maintained without obligation, and freedom from the traditional script of provision and protection. They articulate relief at avoiding perceived imbalances where effort flows disproportionately in one direction while rewards remain uncertain. This perspective challenges long standing assumptions about male roles, suggesting that fulfillment need not hinge on partnership or progeny. At the same time, the broader society confronts the vacuum left by this shift as institutions built around generational renewal strain under reduced capacity and shifting priorities. Women in this context often express a complex mix of independence and longing. Greater career opportunities and financial autonomy allow many to thrive individually. Yet the scarcity of committed partners limits options for those desiring family life. Some adapt by focusing on professional achievements or close friendships, while others explore alternative paths such as international connections or delayed timelines for parenthood. The overall dynamic reveals a shared predicament where disconnection harms both sides, albeit in different ways, underscoring the need for approaches that address root causes rather than symptoms. Looking ahead, the trajectory points toward continued contraction unless fundamental realignments occur in incentives, expectations, and cultural narratives around relationships. The window for meaningful course correction narrows with each passing year as smaller cohorts enter reproductive ages, and aging accelerates demands on remaining resources. Japan's story serves as a profound illustration of how collective individual choices, when aligned in one direction, can reshape an entire nation's future in ways few anticipated. The mounting evidence from Japan's ongoing demographic experiment reveals something far more structural than isolated lifestyle preferences. When men systematically remove themselves from the role of pursuers, providers, and fathers, the entire architecture of family formation buckles under its own weight, and no amount of top down engineering appears capable of propping it back up without addressing the underlying incentives that drove the exit in the first place. Recent internal government assessments leaked to select media outlets in late 2025 acknowledge privately what public statements still dance around. The suite of pronatalist measures enacted since 2023, totaling over 100 trillion yen in cumulative spending when aggregated across national and prefectural budgets, has produced, at best, marginal, short lived bumps in certain localized birth cohorts, while the nationwide trend line continues its steep descent without inflection. This admission, buried in technical appendices rather than headline press releases, underscores a growing recognition among demographers inside the Cabinet Office that financial transfers and workplace tweaks operate on the margin when the fundamental decision to even enter the mating market has already been abandoned by a critical mass of men. A closer examination of cohort specific data sharpens the picture. Men born between 1985 and 1995, the first generation to come of age fully after the asset bubble collapse and during the solidification of herbivore stereotypes, exhibit lifetime marriage rates projected to settle somewhere between 55 and 60%, compared with 70 to 80% for their father's generation at the same age. Among those who remain unmarried by age 40, the proportion reporting zero lifetime sexual partners has climbed steadily in successive national fertility surveys, reaching figures in the mid to high 20s% range for men in their early 40s in the most recent wave released in 2024. These numbers are not outliers driven by fringe subcultures. They reflect mainstream adaptation among ordinary salarymen, technical workers, retail employees, and small business operators who have recalibrated their lives around lower stakes satisfactions. The pattern holds across educational levels and income brackets with only modest variation, indicating that the withdrawal transcends simple economic determinism and has embedded itself as a culturally viable alternative pathway. One under-discussed accelerator of the shift lies in the evolution of male peer culture itself. Where previous generations relied on workplace drinking sessions, company trips, and arranged introductions through relatives or senior colleagues to facilitate romantic connections, today's younger cohorts have largely abandoned those channels. Social drinking has declined sharply, corporate entertainment budgets have shrunk under compliance pressures, and the informal matchmaking role, once played by older women in families or neighborhoods, has atrophied as those networks weaken. In place of those organic pipelines, men have built parallel social worlds through hobby circles, online gaming clans, sports groups, and interest based meetups that deliberately exclude romantic agendas. These spaces provide belonging, status, and emotional support without the vulnerability or competition inherent in dating. The absence of pressure to perform courtship within these groups normalizes non participation in the broader sexual marketplace, turning what might have been temporary disengagement into a semi permanent life orientation for many. Another layer involves the changing legal and institutional landscape surrounding intimate relationships. Expanded definitions of harassment, mandatory workplace training programs, and high profile cases that receive intense media coverage have collectively raised the perceived cost of missteps to prohibitive levels for risk averse individuals. Many men now operate under a default rule of non engagement outside tightly scripted professional or familial contexts, reasoning that the potential professional, financial, and reputational damage from even an innocent misunderstanding outweighs any possible upside from pursuing interest. This risk calculus receives reinforcement from viral stories circulated in online male spaces, where anonymous accounts detail careers derailed or social circles fractured over allegations that began as ambiguous encounters. Whether statistically representative or not, the narratives shape behavior far more powerfully than aggregate crime data, leading to preemptive withdrawal that further shrinks the pool of available initiators. The consequences ripple outward into unexpected domains. Real estate developers in secondary cities report accelerating vacancies in family sized apartments as young adults remain in single occupancy units or parental homes indefinitely. Manufacturers of infant and toddler products adjust production downward year after year, with some lines discontinued entirely. Elementary school teacher training programs face enrollment shortfalls as the pipeline of future students contracts, forcing reallocations of public education budgets toward adult retraining and elder services instead. Even cultural output reflects the shift. Popular media increasingly depicts solitary male protagonists finding meaning outside conventional family narratives, a storytelling pivot that both mirrors and reinforces the lived experience of the audience. These micro adjustments accumulate into macro restructuring, quietly redesigning a society around the assumption of permanently smaller generations. Policy architects have begun experimenting with more unconventional levers in response to the stubborn inertia of conventional approaches. Pilot programs in select prefectures now subsidize group dating events organized by local governments, complete with icebreaker activities, professional facilitators, and follow up matchmaking support. Others offer tax credits tied specifically to first marriages rather than births, aiming to lower the entry barrier into committed partnerships. A handful of municipalities have launched so called regional revitalization through family formation campaigns that combine housing grants, job placement assistance for couples who relocate together, and public matchmaking festivals featuring prominent local figures as hosts. Early evaluations show modest increases in participant numbers and subsequent dates, yet conversion rates into marriages and births remain low, suggesting that structural encouragement alone cannot overcome deeply ingrained reluctance when the underlying preference ordering has already tilted toward solitude. Comparisons with historical episodes of demographic stress provide limited comfort. Post war Japan engineered a rapid fertility rebound through economic reconstruction and pro family messaging. But that rebound occurred within a cultural framework that still strongly equated masculinity with breadwinning and fatherhood. Today's context lacks that unifying script. Instead, competing visions of masculinity, minimalist, otaku inflected, fitness oriented, career nomadic, coexist without any single model achieving hegemony. The absence of consensus about what a desirable male life looks like weakens the social pressure that once channeled men toward marriage and children. When multiple respectable paths to contentment exist outside family formation, the default drift is toward the path requiring the least emotional and financial exposure. The gender asymmetry and adaptation speed further complicates reversal prospects. Women, on average, retain stronger social incentives to form partnerships because biological clocks impose a harder limit on childbearing options, and cultural narratives still place higher value on female relational success than male. Many women therefore continue active searching through apps, events, introductions, or relocation, even as the supply of willing male partners contracts. This imbalance produces visible frustration in online women's communities, where discussions frequently center on the perceived passivity or pickiness of contemporary men. Yet, that very frustration can inadvertently reinforce male withdrawal. When complaints about male behavior circulate widely, they confirm the narrative that engagement carries disproportionate downside risk, deterring fence sitters from re entering the arena. Looking forward, plausible scenarios range from managed decline to radical discontinuity. In the baseline projection, Japan continues shrinking at roughly 500,000 people per year net, reaching perhaps 90 million by 2050 and 75 million by 2070, with dependency ratios climbing past one working age adult for every retiree in many regions. Aggressive immigration remains politically constrained by long-standing homogeneity preferences, though targeted skilled worker programs expand slowly. Technological substitution, robotics in elder care, automation in agriculture and manufacturing mitigates some labor shortages but cannot replicate the social and emotional roles once filled by younger generations. Under these conditions, national identity gradually reorients around quality over quantity, emphasizing per capita prosperity, cultural preservation through archives and digital means, and selective global influence rather than demographic weight. An alternative path requires a genuine recalibration of incentives visible enough to alter male cost benefit calculations at scale. That would demand not merely more money, but a cultural relegitimation of male initiative in relationships, paired with meaningful reductions in perceived risks and economic penalties for family formation. Such a shift would likely necessitate coordinated action across media, education, corporate governance, and public discourse, efforts that have so far remained fragmented and tentative. Without that broader realignment, the current trajectory appears self reinforcing. Smaller cohorts mean even fewer potential partners in the next generation, which further normalizes withdrawal, which accelerates the shrinkage still more. Japan's unfolding experience therefore functions as a live laboratory for questions that many advanced societies will eventually confront. How durable are traditional family formation mechanisms when economic security no longer requires them, when alternative sources of meaning proliferate, and when the perceived hazards of cross gender interaction rise? The answers emerging from this laboratory are sobering. Men's collective decision to walk away has proven far more consequential than any individual philosopher, activist, or policymaker anticipated, demonstrating that withdrawal, when practiced at population scale, constitutes one of the most powerful levers available for reshaping societal outcomes. The scale of Japan's demographic implosion has now crossed thresholds that force even cautious institutions to speak in terms once reserved for existential risk assessments. Internal modeling circulated within the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare During the final quarter of 2025 projects that, under prevailing behavioral patterns, the number of women of prime childbearing age, roughly 20 to 39, will shrink by approximately 28% between 2025 and 2045, independent of any fertility rate improvement. That contraction alone guarantees a smaller absolute number of births, even if the total fertility rate somehow climbed back toward 1.8, because the base population of potential mothers will have contracted so severely. This compounding effect, sometimes called demographic momentum in reverse, means the country has already locked in at least 2 more decades of accelerating population loss before any hypothetical turnaround could begin to register in headline figures. Men's sustained withdrawal from relationship formation sits at the center of this momentum because it was their reduced initiation that first throttled the formation of childbearing unions. Once that throttle closed, the downstream pipeline of mothers shrank mechanically year after year. Within this shrinking pool, mating market dynamics have grown increasingly distorted. Data from major commercial matchmaking services and dating application operators show a persistent imbalance in active participation. Women remain roughly 50 to 60% more likely than men in the same age bands to maintain paid subscriptions, upload recent photographs, and respond to initial messages. Men's engagement, by contrast, has plateaued at low levels or continued to drift downward, with many accounts going dormant after brief trials. Industry insiders describe the current environment as a buyer's market for women and a seller's market for high status men, where the top decile of male profiles, judged by income verification, height, educational credentials, and photographic presentation, capture a wildly disproportionate share of attention and matches. The bottom 60 to 70% of men, even those with stable employment and average appearance, report near zero success rates after hundreds of swipes or messages, prompting them to delete profiles entirely and return to offline solitary routines. This extreme Pareto distribution of romantic outcomes reinforces the incentive to abstain. When the median man perceives near certain rejection and the exceptional man reaps outsized rewards, the rational choice for most is to conserve energy and avoid the platform altogether. Offline social venues have not escaped this polarization. Singles oriented events, speed dating nights, hobby based mixers, regional matchmaking parties frequently report attendance ratios skewed toward women by ratios as high as 3 to 1 or worse in urban centers. Organizers quietly admit that without aggressive marketing directed at men, many gatherings would collapse for lack of male participants. When men do attend, a noticeable subset adopts a passive stance. They show up, converse politely when approached, but rarely initiate deeper follow up or express clear romantic intent. The behavior pattern aligns with what psychologists term defensive pessimism applied to courtship. Expect nothing, risk nothing, lose nothing. Over repeated cycles, these events become confirmation theaters for both sides. Women see firsthand the scarcity of proactive partners. Men see confirmation that initiative is rarely rewarded, and both groups adjust expectations downward, further thinning future attendance. Corporate Japan has started to feel secondary tremors from the relational vacuum. Human resources departments in large firms note rising requests for single status accommodations. Employees declining transfers that would disrupt established solo living arrangements, resisting postings that separate them from long term pet care responsibilities, or openly stating during performance reviews that they prioritize personal time over career tracks traditionally linked to family provider status. Some companies have quietly adjusted succession planning to account for lower assumed willingness to relocate for promotion among men in their late 20s and 30s. In sectors dependent on long term loyalty, such as manufacturing, civil engineering, and public infrastructure, managers report increasing difficulty retaining talent past age 35, as single men with no dependents feel freer to exit stressful roles for less demanding freelance, remote, or part time arrangements. The traditional trade off of endurance in exchange for eventual family security has lost its appeal when family formation itself no longer motivates large numbers. Cultural production continues to adapt in real time, subtly normalizing and even romanticizing the solitary male archetype. Television dramas and streaming originals increasingly feature protagonists who achieve quiet fulfillment through mastery of niche crafts, travel, or intellectual pursuits rather than through romantic conquest or domestic stability. Manga and light novels aimed at adult male readers devote growing shelf space to isekai variants and slice of life stories where the male lead deliberately rejects or sidesteps romantic subplots in favor of personal sovereignty. Music labels promote artists whose lyrics celebrate minimalism, independence, and freedom from relational obligation, resonating with an audience that finds emotional safety in lyrics promising escape from pressure rather than promises of partnership. These cultural artifacts do not cause the withdrawal, they reflect and gently reinforce it, providing aesthetic legitimacy to a life choice that was once quietly pitied or pathologized. Religious and philosophical traditions, historically marginal in secular Japan, have unexpectedly gained modest traction among men seeking frameworks to justify disengagement. Certain interpretations of Zen minimalism, Stoic inspired self reliance imported through translated books and podcasts, and even rereadings of Bushido emphasizing inner discipline over external obligation find receptive audiences in online communities. These frameworks offer intellectual scaffolding for the decision to prioritize solitude. They reframe withdrawal not as failure or cowardice, but as deliberate mastery over desire and attachment. While the numbers embracing these philosophies remain small relative to the total population, their visibility in male oriented forums and YouTube channels amplifies the message that opting out can carry moral or spiritual weight rather than mere pragmatism. The fiscal strain of supporting an inverted age pyramid now dominates cabinet level debates more openly than at any point since the early 2000s. Actuarial reports tabled in 2025 estimate that Social Security contribution rates, already among the highest in the OECD, will need to rise another 8 to 12 percentage points by 2040 simply to maintain current benefit levels, assuming no major benefit cuts and no dramatic labor force expansion through immigration or robotics productivity gains. Every percentage point increase squeezes disposable income for the remaining working age cohort, which in turn deepens the reluctance to add dependents. This creates a vicious fiscal demographic loop. Lower births mean higher future dependency ratios, which require higher taxes or lower benefits, which further discourage family formation among those still in prime earning and reproductive years. Breaking the loop would demand politically explosive choices, substantial immigration, deep entitlement reform, or sustained productivity miracles that successive governments have so far avoided or implemented only incrementally. International organizations tracking global fertility trends now regularly cite Japan as the leading edge of a broader phenomenon that could eventually touch other high income, low fertility societies. Reports from the United Nations Population Division and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development increasingly frame the Japanese experience as a stress test for post industrial social contracts. When wage growth stagnates, housing remains unaffordable, work demands remain punishing, and cultural scripts around gender roles fracture without clear replacements, the default outcome appears to be voluntary childlessness and permanent sub-replacement fertility. Japan's early arrival at this inflection point gives other nations a preview of potential futures if similar conditions coalesce. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and parts of Southern and Eastern Europe already register comparable or worse fertility rates, though their withdrawal patterns differ in intensity and visibility. The Japanese case stands apart because the male side disengagement is so pronounced and so consistently documented across surveys, administrative data, and commercial behavior. Within Japan itself, a small but growing discourse has begun to question whether the current path should be resisted at all costs or managed as an orderly transition to a permanently smaller, older, wealthier per capita society. Proponents of managed decline argue that attempting to force higher birth rates through ever larger subsidies risks distorting markets, crowding out private investment, and creating dependency without addressing root preferences. They point to the resilience of per capita GDP and living standards despite population shrinkage as evidence that quality can substitute for quantity. Skeptics counter that no society has successfully sustained advanced economy institutions, universal health care, generous pensions, dense urban infrastructure with dependency ratios approaching or exceeding 1 to 1 without either massive immigration or technological leaps that remain speculative. The debate remains academic for now, but its existence signals a psychological shift. Resignation to smaller numbers is no longer unthinkable. These converging pressures, contracting mating markets, polarized outcomes, cultural normalization of solitude, fiscal tightening, and emerging ideological justifications have created a self sustaining equilibrium that resists perturbation. Each element reinforces the others. Fewer relationships produce fewer children. Fewer children produce worse future dependency ratios. Worse ratios produce higher fiscal pressure. Higher pressure deepens economic caution. Caution further discourages relationship formation, and the cycle turns again. Breaking any single link would require coordinated disruption across multiple domains simultaneously, a level of societal consensus and execution that has so far proven elusive. The inertia embedded in Japan's current demographic architecture has now reached a point where even incremental policy adjustments register as little more than background noise against the dominant trend line. Internal simulations run by university affiliated research groups in 2025 and early 2026 consistently forecast that, barring an unforeseen behavioral reversal among men in their 20s and 30s, the total population will likely dip below 100 million sometime between 2038 and 2041, with the working age cohort, defined as 20 to 64, shrinking by roughly 35% over the same interval relative to 2025 levels. These projections incorporate conservative assumptions about slight fertility upticks from ongoing subsidies and modest net immigration gains, yet the math remains unforgiving. Each successive cohort enters reproductive age already smaller than the one before it, and the proportion of men who actively pursue long term partnerships shows no statistically detectable rebound in any nationally representative survey conducted since 2020. The withdrawal has calcified into a structural feature rather than a transient phase. One dimension that has received insufficient attention in mainstream reporting concerns the cascading impact on Japan's scientific and technological edge. Fields requiring sustained, large scale human capital, semiconductor process engineering, advanced materials research, fusion energy prototyping, next generation robotics depend on a steady influx of young researchers who can commit decades to highly specialized, often low visibility work before breakthroughs materialize. As undergraduate and graduate enrollments in STEM disciplines contract in line with the 18 to 22 age cohort, universities have begun consolidating departments, merging graduate programs, and quietly reducing intake targets. Corporate R&D budgets, while still substantial in absolute terms, face increasing difficulty filling specialized roles. Headhunters report that mid-career engineers and scientists with niche expertise now command salary premiums 20 to 30% above historical norms simply because the replacement pipeline has narrowed so dramatically. The risk is not an immediate collapse of innovation capacity, but a gradual erosion. Fewer parallel research tracks pursued, longer lead times for incremental improvements, and a creeping reliance on imported talent that domestic political currents continue to constrain. Over multiple decades, this dynamic could reposition Japan from a primary generator of frontier technology to a sophisticated adopter and refiner of advances originating elsewhere. Healthcare delivery systems provide another stark illustration of downstream strain. The number of physicians entering residency programs has already begun to plateau, and in some specialties, decline as the applicant pool contracts. Rural hospitals and clinics face chronic staffing shortages that force service reductions or outright closures. Patients in outlying prefectures increasingly travel hours for routine procedures that once occurred locally. Nursing home capacity, even with aggressive construction programs, cannot keep pace with the projected demand from the baby boomer cohort now entering its 80s and 90s. Private equity funds and foreign operators have started acquiring smaller facilities, introducing efficiency measures that sometimes prioritize occupancy rates over personalized care. Emergency response times in depopulated regions have lengthened measurably, and public health campaigns aimed at lifestyle diseases must now stretch thinner resources across a geography where the client base thins out year by year. The system still functions, but the margin for error shrinks continuously. And every influenza season or heat wave exposes fresh vulnerabilities that would have been buffered by a larger, younger workforce in earlier decades. Transportation infrastructure reveals parallel pressures. Shinkansen lines and regional rail networks, engineered for peak 20th century passenger volumes, now operate with growing numbers of lightly used services. Operators have responded with selective frequency reductions, station unstaffing, and outright line abandonment in low density corridors. Highway maintenance budgets strain under the same arithmetic. Fewer taxpayers support the same kilometers of asphalt, bridges, and tunnels built during the high growth era. Urban subway and bus systems in secondary cities face similar dilemmas. Ridership declines, force fare increases, or service cuts, which in turn accelerate ridership loss in a downward spiral. The physical plant of the nation, its rails, roads, ports, airports, ages faster than replacement capacity can keep up, creating a slow motion degradation that becomes visible only when cumulative neglect crosses critical thresholds. Energy policy confronts an analogous bind. Nuclear restarts proceed incrementally amid persistent public skepticism, while renewable build-out lags behind targets due to land acquisition difficulties in depopulated rural areas and grid upgrade costs that must be spread across a shrinking rate base. Liquefied natural gas imports remain the de facto bridge fuel, exposing the country to global price volatility that weighs heavier on households and industries as per capita consumption remains high, but the total economic pie contracts. Long-term decarbonization scenarios that once assumed robust population stability now require steeper per capita emissions cuts to meet international commitments. placing additional pressure on industrial competitiveness at precisely the moment when labor force shrinkage already squeezes productivity growth. Education at all levels adapts to the new reality with varying degrees of success. Elementary schools in many prefectures have closed or merged at rates that would have seemed unthinkable 2 decades ago. Surviving institutions often operate with multi-grade classrooms and itinerant specialist teachers. Junior high and high school enrollment drops trigger teacher reallocations, program cuts, and, in extreme cases, building demolitions to reduce maintenance liabilities. Universities face the most acute crunch. Private institutions in regional cities report application numbers falling below viability thresholds, prompting mergers, closures, or pivots toward adult continuing education models. National universities, while protected by public funding, reduce faculty lines through attrition and consolidate research centers. The overall effect is a contraction of intellectual infrastructure that was once taken for granted as a source of national strength. Municipal finance tells a parallel story of quiet unraveling. Local governments in depopulating regions see property tax bases erode as vacant homes multiply and commercial districts hollow out. Many now rely on central government equalization grants for basic operations. Yet those grants themselves face downward pressure as national tax revenues grow more slowly than entitlement spending. Some towns have resorted to symbolic measures, offering free land parcels, one-time cash grants for new residents, or even nominal payments for newborns. Yet these experiments rarely move the needle on migration or fertility when weighed against the structural disincentives that keep young adults away. The cumulative outcome is a patchwork of administrative survival strategies that mask but do not resolve the underlying insolvency trajectory for hundreds of smaller jurisdictions. Amid these macro level strains, micro level adaptations among individuals and households reveal both resilience and fragility. Many single men in their 30s and 40s describe routines built around deliberate simplicity, modest apartments or parental homes, reliable mid range salaries, hobby investments that deliver consistent satisfaction, and social networks sustained through low maintenance channels. They report lower stress levels, better sleep, fewer financial surprises, and a sense of control that they associate with the decision to remain unpartnered. For some, this lifestyle represents liberation from expectations they never fully embraced. For others, it constitutes a pragmatic truce with a world that no longer rewards traditional male striving in proportion to the effort required. The pattern suggests that large scale withdrawal has passed the tipping point where social stigma once deterred participation. Solitude now carries its own legitimacy and momentum. Women navigating the same landscape exhibit a wider range of responses. Some double down on career trajectories, leveraging autonomy to achieve financial security and personal milestones that once depended on partnership. Others maintain as active searches while tempering expectations, accepting that proactive initiative from men has become the exception rather than the norm. A growing subset explores non traditional paths, egg freezing followed by single parenthood via donor insemination, co parenting arrangements without romance, or relocation to cities or countries perceived to offer more balanced gender dynamics. These choices reflect pragmatic adaptation to scarcity rather than ideological rejection of family life. Yet they also underscore how deeply the relational ecosystem has contracted. The cumulative weight of these individual and institutional adjustments points toward a future Japan that looks profoundly different from its 20th century predecessor. National power will likely rest less on demographic mass and more on concentrated excellence in select domains: precision manufacturing, high end materials, cultural soft power. niche technological leadership, while basic service provision becomes leaner and more automated. Social cohesion may shift toward looser, more voluntary forms of connection as traditional family and community structures recede. The emotional texture of everyday life could tilt further toward individualism, with loneliness managed through digital proxies and curated solitude rather than relational density. Whether this trajectory ultimately stabilizes as a viable new equilibrium or tips into accelerated fragility remains an open question. What is no longer open is the recognition that men's widespread decision to step back from courtship, marriage, and fatherhood has functioned as the decisive catalyst. By choosing peace over participation at population scale, they have rewritten the operating system of an entire society in ways that policy alone cannot easily reverse. The relentless contraction of Japan's population has now moved beyond abstract projections into tangible, day to day operational realities that touch every layer of national life in ways that were once dismissed as alarmist speculation. By mid 2026, census updates confirm that more than 40% of all municipalities have fallen below the critical population threshold of 10,000 residents needed to sustain basic independent administrative functions without heavy external support. In these shrinking towns and villages, local assemblies debate whether to maintain aging community centers, fund seasonal festivals that once drew crowds from neighboring prefectures, or continue operating public bathhouses that served as informal social hubs for decades. Decisions that used to revolve around tradition or civic pride now hinge on cold arithmetic, projected tax revenue versus maintenance costs projected 10 years forward. When the numbers fail to balance, the default outcome is closure, consolidation into neighboring jurisdictions, or outright dissolution of the municipality itself, erasing place names from official maps that have existed for centuries. This administrative withering represents one of the quietest yet most profound markers of a society that has lost the critical mass required to reproduce its own geography. Agricultural landscapes undergo parallel transformation. Family farms that once supported multiple generations now stand fallow as heirs choose urban careers or simply decline to continue operations that demand physical labor with diminishing economic returns. Rice paddies, once meticulously terraced and flooded each spring, revert to scrubland or are converted to solar arrays under government incentives that pay better than grain prices have in years. The average age of active farmers has climbed past 68, with succession rates dropping below 20% in many rural prefectures. Mechanization and drone assisted planting help maintain output in the short term, yet the loss of intimate place specific knowledge, soil quirks, microclimate patterns, heirloom seed varieties accumulates quietly. Food security planners now incorporate worst case scenarios that assume continued farmland shrinkage could force greater reliance on imports precisely when global supply chains face their own volatility from climate shifts and geopolitical tensions. The countryside, long romanticized as the spiritual backbone of the nation, increasingly functions as a managed reserve rather than a living, self sustaining ecosystem. Fisheries face an equally stark reckoning. Coastal communities that once supported fleets of small trawlers and family owned processing plants now contend with aging boat owners who lack successors and with labor shortages that make even seasonal crewing difficult. Younger men who might have entered the trade see little appeal in multi day voyages, unpredictable catches, and incomes that struggle to compete with urban minimum wage jobs offering predictable hours and air conditioning. Aquaculture operations attempt to fill the gap, Yet they too require skilled technicians and consistent investment that becomes harder to secure when local consumer bases shrink. The result is a gradual hollowing out of fishing ports. Wharves that once bustled with auction mornings now sit half empty, warehouses converted to storage for unrelated goods, and entire hamlets effectively retired as working communities. National seafood consumption patterns shift toward farmed imports and plant based substitutes, subtly altering dietary traditions that stretch back generations. Forestry and timber industries reveal similar patterns of retreat. Mountain villages, once centered around sustainable logging cycles, now watch secondary growth forests reclaim abandoned access roads and skidding trails. The workforce skews heavily toward men in their 60s and 70s who continue part time because pensions remain insufficient. Younger replacements prove scarce even when wages rise. Processing mills consolidate or close as domestic demand for wood products softens alongside population decline, while export markets face competition from faster growing plantation timber in Southeast Asia and South America. The ecological consequence is mixed. Carbon sequestration improves in unmanaged forests, yet the managed landscapes that once balanced timber production with biodiversity maintenance lose their stewards, allowing invasive species and wildfire risks to rise in some regions. What begins as an economic story ends up reshaping the physical environment itself. Retail and service sectors in smaller cities and towns illustrate how consumer markets contract in lockstep with population. Department stores that anchored downtown shopping districts for 50 years shutter their regional branches one by one, unable to cover fixed costs when foot traffic falls below viability thresholds. Convenience store chains, long the lifeblood of neighborhood commerce, rationalize store counts aggressively. Some locations close permanently, others reduce hours to part time or become automated kiosks with minimal staff. Local restaurants, barber shops, dry cleaners, and small grocery outlets follow the same logic. When regular customers age out or move away without replacements, the business model collapses. Owners in their late 50s and 60s often choose retirement over sale because no buyer emerges willing to take on a declining market. The visible result is street after street of metal shutters, faded signs, and empty storefronts that signal not temporary recession, but permanent demographic retreat. Banking and financial services adapt through consolidation and digitization. Yet even these relatively resilient sectors feel the pinch. Regional banks that once thrived on relationship lending to local businesses and households now manage shrinking loan books and deposit bases. Branch networks contract sharply. ATMs replace tellers, and mobile apps handle routine transactions. Wealth management divisions pivot toward serving the elderly affluent, focusing on inheritance planning, long term care insurance, and reverse mortgages rather than growth oriented investment products aimed at young families. The shift reflects a broader reorientation of the financial system away from expansion and toward preservation and accumulation, mirroring the national transition from growth to managed stasis. Real estate markets outside the major metropolitan cores tell a story of accelerating depreciation. Condominium buildings constructed during the bubble era now enter their fourth and fifth decades with repair backlogs that outstrip sinking property values. Owners associations struggle to fund seismic retrofits, elevator replacements, or common area maintenance when a growing proportion of units stand vacant or occupied by elderly residents on fixed incomes. In extreme cases, entire buildings are designated for demolition because no feasible renovation plan emerges. Suburban developments that once housed young families now age in place, with resale values stagnating or declining in real terms year after year. The dream of homeownership as a reliable wealth building vehicle fades for younger cohorts who see little point in tying up capital in assets likely to depreciate faster than inflation. Urban cores, while more insulated, are not immune. Tokyo and Osaka maintain relative stability through in-migration from smaller cities and international students, yet even these magnets experience selective hollowing. Certain commuter rail suburbs see ridership drop sharply as remote work arrangements allow younger professionals to relocate farther out or leave the region entirely for lower cost living in regional hubs. Office vacancy rates in secondary business districts climb as companies consolidate footprints post pandemic and as smaller firms fail to replace retiring owners. The result is a resorting of urban space. Prime central districts remain competitive while peripheral zones soften, creating sharper gradients of prosperity and neglect within the same metropolitan area. Public safety services stretch thinner with each passing year. Police departments in rural prefectures report difficulty maintaining 24-hour coverage as officer retirements outpace recruitment. Fire stations merge coverage zones, lengthening response times for structure fires and medical emergencies in outlying areas. Search and rescue capacity for mountainous terrain declines as volunteer brigades shrink alongside the young male population that historically supplied most members. The overall effect is not dramatic collapse, but a steady erosion of the safety margin that residents once took for granted. These sectoral contractions converge to produce a society that increasingly manages decline rather than pursuing renewal. National discourse has begun to split between two broad camps. One argues for aggressive adaptation, lean government, automation wherever feasible, selective immigration focused on high skill contributors, and a cultural embrace of smaller scale excellence over mass reproduction. The other insists that demographic shrinkage at this velocity threatens the continuity of core institutions, universal healthcare, public pensions, dense public transportation, localized education, and demands a fundamental reexamination of incentives that might still persuade larger numbers of men to re-engage with family formation. Neither side has yet produced a politically viable consensus package capable of altering the entrenched behavioral equilibrium. The deeper truth emerging from this extended experiment is that withdrawal, once begun at sufficient scale, generates its own reinforcing physics. Each year of lower births produces a smaller pool of potential future parents. Each year of fewer parents reduces the cultural and economic case for partnership. Each year of reduced partnership normalizes solitude as the baseline expectation. Breaking that cycle requires not tweaks, but a reordering of preferences so substantial that it borders on cultural revolution, an outcome that current political and social conditions make improbable in the near term. Japan therefore stands as the first advanced society to confront, in real time, the full implications of men choosing exit over participation when the perceived costs of entry exceed the perceived rewards. The resulting reconfiguration of economy, infrastructure, culture, and national self conception will likely define the country's trajectory for the remainder of the century, offering both a warning and a case study for any nation that assumes traditional family formation dynamics are immutable. The administrative dissolution of smaller municipalities has now progressed to the point where entire prefectural subregions function more as historical administrative relics than as self governing entities with meaningful autonomy. In several rural prefectures, clusters of former towns have been absorbed into single enlarged municipalities through forced mergers that preserve the name of the largest former entity, while quietly phasing out local councils, independent budgets, and community specific ordinances. Residents in these newly consolidated areas often discover that services once delivered at the village level, snow removal on side streets, maintenance of small irrigation channels, or operation of neighborhood assembly halls, are now rationed according to centralized priorities that favor denser population pockets. The psychological impact registers slowly. A sense of place erodes when the postal address changes, when the local mayor becomes a distant figure in a county seat hours away, and when annual town festivals shrink to token gatherings attended mostly by the elderly. What begins as bureaucratic streamlining ends up severing the last threads of civic identity for communities that once defined themselves through distinct dialects, seasonal rituals, and shared labor on communal lands. This loss of local sovereignty feeds directly into migration patterns that accelerate the very decline they were meant to arrest. Young adults who grew up in these shrinking hamlets rarely return after university or initial job placements in larger cities. The absence of viable employment, social venues, and future oriented infrastructure makes the decision straightforward. Those who do contemplate relocation back home often cite the same barriers. No realistic path to home ownership without inheriting an aging, maintenance heavy property. Limited dating prospects in an environment where the local age pyramid inverts dramatically, and a pervasive atmosphere of resignation that clashes with ambitions for career growth or family building. The feedback loop tightens. Fewer returnees mean even less demand for local services, which prompts further cuts, which further discourages return migration. Over time, entire generations effectively vanish from the countryside, leaving behind a landscape dotted with ancestral graves that receive fewer visitors each Oban season, and houses that stand empty until nature reclaims them. The tourism sector, long positioned as a potential savior for depopulating regions, has instead become another domain where demographic reality imposes harsh limits. Onsen towns that once drew weekend crowds from Tokyo now operate at 20 to 30% of historical occupancy during peak seasons. Ryokan owners in their 70s delay retirement because no family member expresses interest in taking over operations that require constant physical upkeep and 24-hour guest service. Many properties convert to long stay senior housing or are sold to investment groups that repurpose them as remote work retreats. Yet, these adaptations rarely generate the foot traffic or tax revenue needed to sustain surrounding businesses. Ski resorts in northern Honshu face parallel challenges. Shorter snow seasons due to warming trends compound the problem of fewer young families booking winter vacations. Lift operators, instructors, and lodge staff skew older each year, with recruitment drives yielding diminishing returns. The cultural narrative that once cast rural Japan as a restorative escape from urban stress now competes with international destinations offering better value, newer facilities, and more reliable snow or hot spring experiences. Manufacturing supply chains rooted in regional clusters reveal vulnerabilities that national headlines rarely capture. Small and medium sized enterprises that supply precision components to larger assemblers in automotive, electronics, and machinery sectors face succession crises as founding owners reach their 80s without heirs willing to inherit debt laden operations or the intense quality control demands of just in time production. When these firms close or consolidate, the ripple reaches tier one suppliers and eventually final assemblers who must scramble for alternative sources, often overseas. The vaunted resilience of Japan's keiretsu networks frays at the edges as these hidden champions disappear one by one. Government programs offering subsidies for digital transformation or automation help some survivors. Yet, the capital required often exceeds what a shrinking domestic market can justify. The net effect is a subtle but cumulative offshoring of intermediate production steps that once anchored regional economies, further weakening the case for young people to remain in or return to those areas. Defense and national security planning must now incorporate demographic constraints that were never contemplated when current force structures were designed. The self defense forces struggle to meet recruitment quotas despite pay increases, signing bonuses, and aggressive advertising campaigns that emphasize adventure, camaraderie, and technical training. The pool of eligible young men, physically fit, without major medical disqualifications, and willing to accept the lifestyle demands of military service, shrinks in lockstep with the overall youth cohort. Specialized roles requiring advanced technical skills face even steeper shortfalls. Cyber defense units, missile maintenance teams, and maritime patrol aircraft crews compete for talent with private sector employers offering comparable or better compensation without the risk of overseas deployment or rigid hierarchies. Long-term readiness planners now model scenarios in which force size must contract permanently or rely more heavily on reservists, civilian contractors, and unmanned systems simply to maintain credible deterrence. The strategic implication is clear. A smaller population translates into reduced conventional military capacity unless offset by qualitative leaps in technology and alliances, offsets that carry their own political and fiscal trade offs. Space and oceanographic research programs confront analogous human capital bottlenecks. Launch facilities on remote islands and deep sea exploration vessels require crews with specialized training and willingness to endure long deployments far from family support networks. As the number of young engineers and scientists entering these fields declines, project timelines stretch and some missions get deferred or scaled back. International collaborations help fill gaps, yet dependence on foreign partners introduces vulnerabilities in supply chains for critical components and in access to shared orbital or seabed data. The ambition to maintain Japan as a leading player in lunar exploration, asteroid sample return, and subsea bed resource mapping remains intact on paper. But execution increasingly hinges on a shrinking demographic base that cannot be easily expanded through domestic means alone. Cultural heritage preservation efforts face their own quiet crisis. Traditional performing arts, no, kabuki, bunraku, kagura, rely on multi-generational transmission of highly codified techniques that demand years of apprenticeship under master performers. With fewer young men entering these disciplines, troops shrink, performance schedules thin, and some regional variants risk extinction within a single generation. Craft traditions such as lacquerware, swordsmithing, washi paper making, and indigo dyeing encounter parallel succession problems. Workshops close when elderly artisans retire without apprentices, and the market for high end artisanal goods contracts alongside the affluent elderly cohort that once provided the bulk of buyers. National and prefectural designation programs offer financial support and public recognition. Yet, money alone cannot manufacture the decades long commitment required to master these arts. The cumulative loss is not merely economic, but existential. Pieces of intangible cultural heritage fade from living practice into museum display or archival record. Sports leagues and community athletics reflect the same demographic squeeze. Local baseball, soccer, and rugby clubs in smaller cities struggle to field youth teams as elementary and middle school enrollment drops below the minimum needed for competitive divisions. High school tournaments that once drew national attention now feature smaller brackets or merged regional qualifiers. Professional leagues maintain visibility in major markets, yet attendance in secondary cities softens as the fan base ages without sufficient replenishment from younger generations. The broader social function of sport, building discipline, teamwork, and regional pride among young males, weakens in areas where the critical mass of participants simply no longer exists. These dispersed but interlocking contractions create a national environment where the default trajectory is continued managed retreat rather than revival. Official rhetoric still emphasizes countermeasures and revitalization, yet budget documents and implementation reports increasingly allocate resources toward mitigation. Automated elder care robots, expanded telehealth, streamlined administrative mergers, targeted infrastructure decommissioning, rather than toward measures that would meaningfully increase the number of young adults forming families. The shift in emphasis signals tacit acceptance that the window for demographic reversal has narrowed to the point where realistic goals center on softening the landing rather than changing the flight path. The underlying driver remains unchanged. The widespread, sustained decision by men to exit the conventional relationship and reproduction cycle has proven more powerful than any combination of incentives deployed so far. That exit has not occurred in isolation. It interacts with every other structural pressure: housing costs, work demands, risk perceptions, alternative satisfactions, cultural reframing, to produce an equilibrium that is stable precisely because it requires no further collective action to maintain itself. Reversing it would demand a level of coordinated disruption across economic, legal, cultural, and technological domains that no government has yet assembled the political will or public mandate to attempt. Japan's current chapter, therefore, stands as the most fully documented instance in modern history of a society undergoing rapid, involuntary reconfiguration because one half of its reproductive equation has quietly stepped away. The consequences unfold not in sudden catastrophe, but in the steady, relentless subtraction of capacity, connection, and continuity that once defined national life. The erosion of civic identity in these merged municipalities carries consequences that extend far beyond paperwork and boundary lines into the realm of collective memory and intergenerational transmission. When a village that once maintained its own fire brigade, shrine committee, and seasonal harvest celebrations loses its independent status, the rituals tied to that place begin to fade from regular practice. Grandchildren who might have learned the specific chants for a local matsuri or the proper way to clean the communal well now grow up with only vague stories from grandparents rather than direct participation. The physical markers, stone lanterns inscribed with family names from the Edo period, small roadside Jizo statues tended annually, community notice boards announcing long-standing mutual aid arrangements gradually fall into disrepair or are relocated to central depots where they lose context. Over one or two generations, what was once a living, place specific culture becomes archival material stored in prefectural museums or digitized for occasional academic reference. The nation loses not just population, but thousands of micro traditions that once gave texture and variety to Japanese life, replaced by a more homogenized, urban derived default that spreads outward from the surviving larger cities. This cultural flattening interacts powerfully with the rise of virtual and mediated experience among the remaining younger population. Adolescents and young adults in depopulated regions increasingly turn to online platforms for social connection, entertainment, and even identity formation. Discord servers, VTuber streams, anonymous image boards, and mobile game guilds provide the sense of belonging and status competition that physical communities once supplied. These digital spaces are location agnostic by design. A teenager in a half empty mountain hamlet can achieve the same recognition, drama, and camaraderie as someone in central Tokyo simply by logging in. The result is a detachment from local geography that reinforces out migration. When the most meaningful relationships and achievements happen in servers hosted halfway around the world, the decaying hometown offers little comparative pull. Physical place becomes background scenery rather than the primary arena for self definition, accelerating the abandonment of rural and small town Japan. Mental health statistics reflect the toll of this detachment and shrinkage. Prefecture level public health reports show rising rates of hikikomori like withdrawal, depression diagnoses among working age men, and suicide mortality that remains stubbornly elevated in many rural areas despite national declines in urban centers. The correlation is not simple causation. Economic stagnation, family care burdens on the middle generation, and loss of future oriented hope all contribute. But the pattern is consistent. Places that have lost the critical mass needed for vibrant social networks show higher prevalence of isolation related disorders. Community based prevention programs struggle when the volunteer base itself ages out or moves away. Mental health outreach shifts toward telepsychiatry and automated screening tools, which help manage symptoms but cannot replace the informal support once provided by neighbors, coworkers, and extended kin. The paradox is stark. A society famous for group harmony now confronts widespread loneliness precisely because the groups have become too small or too dispersed to function as safety nets. Elder care, already under severe strain, faces an additional layer of complexity as the geography of aging becomes more fragmented. In regions where adult children have relocated to urban job centers, the default model of family provided support collapses. Professional caregivers, home helpers, visiting nurses, day service staff must cover larger territories with fewer colleagues, leading to longer wait times for initial assessments, reduced frequency of visits, and reliance on family members who live hours away for emergency coordination. Some elderly residents refuse relocation to urban facilities out of attachment to familiar surroundings. Yet the support infrastructure around them thins year by year. Volunteer groups that once delivered meals, ran errands, or provided companionship shrink as their own members enter their 80s. The system increasingly leans on technology, motion sensors, wearable fall detectors, AI assisted monitoring cameras, remote check in robots. Yet these tools address logistics more than the emotional isolation that comes from days without face to face human contact. The result is a growing cohort of older adults who are physically safe but socially adrift in landscapes that no longer sustain community. Immigration policy, long approached with extreme caution, has edged toward incremental expansion in response to these accumulating shortages. Specified skilled worker visa categories now cover more occupations: nursing aides, construction laborers, agricultural technicians, shipyard welders, with relaxed language requirements and pathways to longer stays. Bilateral agreements with Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Nepal, and Myanmar bring in tens of thousands annually. Yet the total inflow remains a small fraction of the natural population loss. Integration challenges persist. Rural communities with little prior exposure to diversity sometimes display ambivalence or outright resistance to newcomers, while Urban areas absorb most arrivals but cannot redistribute them to the places that need labor most urgently. Language barriers, credential recognition delays, and cultural adjustment issues mean that many foreign workers cluster in metropolitan job markets rather than filling vacancies in depopulated prefectures. The net contribution to demographic stabilization remains modest. Immigration functions as a partial brake on decline rather than a reversal engine. Corporate strategies have begun to reflect this new geographic reality in ways that further entrench urban concentration. Multinational firms and major domestic conglomerates increasingly centralize high-value functions, R&D, strategic planning, brand management in Tokyo, Osaka, or Nagoya, while allowing regional branch offices to shrink or close. Satellite offices in smaller cities once served as training grounds for mid-career managers and local market outposts. Now many are replaced by remote work hubs or eliminated entirely as digital tools make physical presence less necessary. The pattern accelerates brain drain from the provinces. Ambitious graduates target the few remaining prestige employers in the big three metropolitan areas, leaving regional headquarters with skeleton staffs focused on compliance and routine operations. The economic geography of Japan tilts ever more sharply toward a handful of urban nodes, with vast hinterlands relegated to residual roles, resource extraction, basic processing, or subsidized elder care enclaves. Environmental management reveals another dimension of the retreat. National parks and protected forests, once actively patrolled and maintained by rangers and community volunteers, now rely on periodic flyovers, camera traps, and contracted private firms for basic monitoring. Invasive species control programs scale back in low priority zones. Feral deer and boar populations expand unchecked in some mountainous areas, damaging remaining farmland and young tree plantations. River and coastal erosion projects that once employed seasonal local labor now depend on heavy machinery operated by traveling crews from distant bases. Biodiversity monitoring shifts toward automated sensors and citizen science apps, yet coverage thins in the most remote regions. The landscape itself begins to reflect human absence. Abandoned terraced fields revert to woodland, secondary forests thicken without thinning cuts, and wildlife corridors expand in ways that benefit certain species while pressuring others tied to human altered habitats. The cumulative impact on national self understanding cannot be overstated. Japan entered the 21st century with a collective identity rooted in post war recovery, economic miracle, disciplined homogeneity, and shown the promise of continuity across generations. That identity rested on the assumption of demographic stability, or at least manageable slow growth. When the population began shrinking in earnest after 2008, the initial reaction was concern tempered by confidence that policy could correct course. 2 decades later, with births setting new record lows each year and no inflection point in sight, the narrative has shifted toward adaptation within limits. Public intellectuals, corporate leaders, and even some politicians now speak openly of a compact Japan that prioritizes efficiency, technological substitution, cultural archiving, and selective global engagement over traditional measures of national greatness, such as population size or territorial density. This reframing represents a profound psychological adjustment. Acceptance that the Japan of the future will be smaller, older, quieter, more automated, and less tied to physical place than any version that came before. Yet acceptance does not erase tension. Younger cohorts, particularly those in their 20s, express a mix of resignation and quiet anger in anonymous online spaces. They articulate frustration at inheriting a society whose institutions were built for twice the population, whose pensions they will pay into with diminishing returns, and whose housing stock and infrastructure they must maintain with fewer hands. Some frame the withdrawal of their older male peers, and increasingly their own reluctance to form families, as a rational response to a system that no longer delivers proportional rewards for traditional effort. Others see it as a betrayal of collective responsibility. The debate remains largely subterranean, conducted in memes, threads, and private chats rather than mainstream media. Yet its existence signals that the demographic shift has begun to reshape generational consciousness in ways that will influence politics and culture for decades. The deeper lesson embedded in Japan's trajectory is that large scale behavioral change on the part of one gender, in this case, men's sustained withdrawal from courtship, marriage, and reproduction, can override every conventional lever of social engineering when it reaches critical mass. Incentives, subsidies, propaganda, legal reforms, technological fixes, all have been tried in various combinations. Yet the core decision to opt out has proven remarkably sticky. That stickiness arises from the alignment of multiple reinforcing factors: economic disincentives, perceived relational risks, abundant solitary alternatives, shifting cultural scripts, and the self reinforcing mathematics of smaller cohorts producing even smaller future cohorts. Once the equilibrium solidifies, reversing it requires not marginal improvements, but a fundamental rewiring of the incentive landscape so comprehensive that it borders on utopian redesign. As the 2020s draw toward their close, Japan continues to function efficiently in many respects, admirably in others, while quietly subtracting the elements that once defined it as a densely networked, family centered, generationally continuous society. The process unfolds without fanfare, without collapse, but with implacable momentum. Each closed school, shuttered shop, merged village, abandoned field, and darkened festival ground marks another step in the transition to a nation learning to exist at a smaller scale, with fewer voices, fewer children, and a different understanding of what continuity means. The transition toward a compact, urban concentrated Japan has now reached a stage where even the architecture of daily decision making reflects the new demographic baseline. Young adults entering their 20s in 2026 encounter a housing market that has structurally adjusted to smaller household sizes and lower expectations of family expansion. Developers in major cities prioritize compact one bedroom and 1.5 bedroom units designed for single occupancy or childless couples, with floor plans that maximize natural light and minimalism rather than extra bedrooms or family gathering spaces. Shared co living buildings with private rooms and communal kitchens gain popularity among 20 somethings who view homeownership as a distant or unattainable milestone rather than a life stage default. Rental agreements increasingly include flexible lease terms, 6 months, 1 year, month to month, that align with the uncertainty many feel about long term commitments of any kind, whether to a city, a job, or a partner. The physical built environment thus begins to encode the assumption that most households will remain small indefinitely, reinforcing the behavioral patterns that produced the shrinkage in the first place. Transportation planning follows a similar logic of adaptation to reduce demand. High speed rail extensions, once envisioned to link secondary cities more tightly to the core metropolitan areas, have been scaled back or indefinitely postponed in favor of upgrading existing lines for efficiency rather than capacity expansion. Local bus services in suburban and exurban zones convert to demand responsive models using apps that dispatch vehicles only when bookings reach minimum thresholds, effectively ending fixed route coverage in low density corridors. Bicycle sharing and e-scooter networks expand in dense urban cores where they make economic sense, while car ownership rates among people under 30 continue their long decline as parking costs, insurance premiums, and maintenance burdens outweigh the utility for most single or couple households. The transportation system as a whole tilts towards serving concentrated populations with high frequency service in nodal areas and minimal residual coverage elsewhere, mirroring the geographic sorting already underway. Energy consumption patterns shift in tandem. Per capita electricity and gas usage remains relatively high due to aging in place households that keep heating and cooling systems running for single occupants. Yet total national demand plateaus and then begins a gentle downward trajectory as the overall number of dwellings contracts. Utility companies respond by accelerating the rollout of smart grid technologies that allow dynamic pricing and load balancing at the neighborhood level, reducing the need for overbuilt generation capacity. Rooftop solar adoption rises steadily among homeowners who view it as a hedge against future rate increases rather than an environmental statement, while large scale offshore wind and geothermal projects proceed more slowly than originally planned because projected demand growth no longer justifies the capital outlay at previous scales. The energy transition, once framed as a race to decarbonize while growing the economy, quietly reframes itself as a project of maintaining service quality for a stable or shrinking customer base. Retail innovation adapts to the same demographic math. E-commerce fulfillment centers cluster ever closer to the major urban nodes, while last-mile delivery in rural and semi-rural zones increasingly relies on drone drops to community lockers or partnerships with local post offices that double as micro warehouses. Physical stores in secondary cities experiment with hybrid models. Showrooms where customers browse high touch items before ordering online for home delivery, or pop up formats that rotate through empty commercial spaces on short term leases. The convenience store chain with the densest footprint in the world now closes more locations annually than it opens, shifting emphasis toward automated, unstaffed micro stores in apartment building lobbies and train station concourses where foot traffic remains reliable. The retail landscape thus becomes patchier, dense, and tech enabled in surviving urban centers, sparse and service minimal in the periphery. Higher education, already contracting in enrollment, undergoes deeper structural change. National universities in regional cities merge faculties across disciplines to maintain minimum viable class sizes, while private institutions in non metropolitan areas increasingly pivot toward vocational certification programs tailored to local labor shortages. Jia Hu Fu, Ji Shi, training for elder care, heavy machinery operation for construction, drone piloting for agriculture rather than traditional 4 year liberal arts degrees. Online and hybrid degree offerings expand rapidly, allowing students to remain in lower cost living situations while completing coursework. Campus dormitories that once housed thousands now operate at partial capacity, with surplus buildings repurposed for senior co housing, startup incubators, or short term researcher residencies. The university experience itself becomes less tied to physical relocation and more modular, reflecting a generation that sees geographic mobility as a cost rather than an opportunity. Professional service industries, law, accounting, consulting, follow corporate trends toward concentration. Mid-sized regional firms that once handled local business registrations, estate planning, and tax filings for family enterprises now struggle to attract junior associates willing to build careers outside the major cities. Many merge with larger Tokyo or Osaka based practices or transition to virtual only models where client meetings occur via secure video and document execution happens digitally. The result is a hollowing out of professional ecosystems in smaller cities, fewer lawyers available for real time court appearances, fewer accountants with deep knowledge of prefectural subsidy rules, fewer consultants embedded in local chambers of commerce. Knowledge work decouples further from place, concentrating expertise in a handful of urban hubs, while the rest of the country relies on remote access that lacks the nuance and trust built through face to face relationships. The arts and entertainment sector, long a source of national soft power, experiences parallel concentration and digitization. Major film studios and production companies centralize post production and distribution in Tokyo, while regional film commissions that once lured shoots with tax breaks see fewer projects as budgets tighten and crews become harder to assemble locally. Live theater and music venues in secondary cities reduce performance calendars or shift toward tribute acts and cover bands that require minimal rehearsal space and touring overhead. Streaming platforms capture growing audience share by offering on demand access to archive content and low budget original series that can be produced with small, flexible teams rather than large ensembles. Traditional rakugo storytellers, manzai comedy duos, and enka singers find new life through YouTube channels and paid live streams that reach scattered audiences without the need for physical venues. Cultural production thus becomes more centralized in origin, yet more geographically dispersed in consumption, preserving output volume while reducing the number of physical cultural anchors across the country. Sports broadcasting and professional leagues adapt through similar mechanisms. J League soccer clubs in smaller markets survive by tightening budgets, relying on youth academies rather than expensive transfers, and maximizing digital engagement, virtual watch parties, NFT collectibles, interactive apps to supplement gate receipts that no longer cover operating costs. NPB baseball teams in regional cities face attendance pressures that force stadium renovations focused on premium seating and entertainment zones rather than expanded general admission. High school tournaments maintain national visibility through television and streaming, yet local qualifiers draw smaller crowds and fewer participants as school sports clubs consolidate or dissolve. The ritual of weekend youth sports as a community building institution fades in many places, replaced by individual fitness pursuits, running apps, home gym equipment, online coaching that require no team coordination or local facilities. Public broadcasting and media consumption patterns shift in response. NHK, facing license fee revenue pressure from a shrinking household base, reallocates budget toward digital first content, short form documentaries, interactive explainers, AI assisted archival curation, while scaling back regional bureaus and local news production. Commercial networks follow suit, consolidating regional affiliates and focusing prime time slots on formats that travel well nationally or internationally. Print newspapers in smaller cities reduce publication frequency or transition to digital only editions delivered via apps or email summaries. The information ecosystem tilts towards centralized national and global sources, with local news increasingly crowdsourced through community line groups, Facebook pages, and hyper local bloggers who fill gaps left by retreating professional outlets. These adaptations, while preserving functionality in many domains, collectively produce a Japan that feels less continuous with its immediate past. The density of human interaction, chance meetings at the station, overlapping social circles in the neighborhood, multi generational households under one roof, thins out perceptibly. daily life becomes more intentional and curated, with fewer unplanned encounters and more deliberate choices about where and how to connect. For those who remain in depopulating areas, the quiet can feel peaceful or oppressive depending on temperament. For those in the urban cores, the pace quickens, but the social bandwidth narrows as competition for attention and resources intensifies within a smaller pool of peers. The overarching dynamic remains rooted in the initial withdrawal, when men at population scale chose solitude over the uncertainties and costs of courtship and family life. They set in motion a chain reaction that no subsequent intervention has fully arrested. The society now built around that choice, smaller households, concentrated economic activity, digitized relationships, managed decline in peripheral regions, has achieved a form of equilibrium. It sustains itself not through optimism or expansion, but through efficiency, substitution, and lowered expectations. Whether this equilibrium proves durable for another half century or eventually tips into more acute fragility will depend on variables still unfolding: the pace of automation, the political appetite for immigration reform, the resilience of cultural identity in a smaller population, and whether younger generations eventually recalibrate their own preferences in response to the world they inherit. Japan today therefore embodies a rare, real time case study in what happens when one gender's mass exit from reproduction reshapes everything downstream. The result is not apocalypse, but a steady, almost imperceptible recalibration toward a quieter, more contained national existence, one that works, functions, even prospers in per capita terms, yet carries within it the memory of a denser, more relational past that no policy can fully resurrect. If you have stayed locked in through this extended mapping of adaptation across every major sector, you belong to the 2 hour gang that insists on following the thread to its furthest logical extensions. If these angry guy examinations continue to deliver the kind of layered, unflinching clarity you value on societal turning points, consider buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description to help me power the next phase of this depth. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Looking at the cumulative shift toward intentional, curated, and centralized living described here, do you see this as a sustainable new normal for advanced societies? Or does it represent a transitional phase that will eventually force more radical breaks with the past? Like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.